April 1st, 1945. Okinawa, Japan. The harsh winds of the Pacific battered the beaches as United States Marines made their amphibious assault. The distant hum of landing crafts mingled with gunfire, filling the morning air with the sounds of invasion. In makeshift shelters across the island, Japanese women clutched ration cards and government-issued leaflets, warning them of their fate. Imperial propaganda had drilled one message into every civilian mind: surrender meant death, or worse. American soldiers would show no mercy. Yet within days, thousands of these same women found themselves alive, fed, and treated with unexpected care. Japanese commanders expected mass civilian casualties. American field reports soon showed something different. Women who had prepared for execution received food, medical treatment, and shelter instead. This marked a turning point no one had anticipated, a moment when wartime expectations collided with an entirely different reality. April 1st, 1945, marked the beginning of Operation Iceberg. At 0830 hours, the first wave of United States Marines landed on the western beaches of Okinawa. The roar of naval artillery had pounded Japanese positions since before dawn. LVT amphibious vehicles, each carrying 20 Marines, churned through the surf and onto the sand. M4 Sherman tanks followed close behind, their tracks grinding over coral and volcanic rock. The invasion force numbered over 180,000 troops. This made it one of the largest amphibious operations in the Pacific theater. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the Fifth Fleet, providing naval support with over 1,400 vessels. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner led the 10th Army, comprising both Marine and Army divisions. Japanese defenses had been carefully prepared. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded approximately 110,000 troops, including local Okinawan conscripts. But his strategy differed from previous Pacific battles. Rather than defending the beaches, Japanese forces had withdrawn to fortified positions in the southern interior. This left the initial landing zones eerily quiet. Major General Roy Geiger commanded the 3rd Amphibious Corps, which included the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions. His orders contained unusual instructions for a combat operation. A directive issued March 28th stated clearly, "Civilian populations are to be distinguished from combatants. Non-combatants will be treated in accordance with international law and military policy." This directive reflected a significant shift in American military thinking. Earlier Pacific campaigns had seen massive civilian casualties, particularly in Saipan, where thousands of Japanese civilians had committed suicide rather than surrender. American commanders had studied these tragic outcomes. They recognized that Imperial propaganda had convinced civilians that capture meant torture and death. The first days of the invasion proceeded with minimal resistance. Marines pushed inland rapidly, securing the central portion of the island. By April 3rd, they had cut Okinawa in two, isolating the northern section. Civilians began emerging from caves and shelters, their faces showing shock and confusion. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, serving with the 1st Marine Division, later wrote in his memoir, "We had been told the civilians might be hostile. Instead, we found them terrified and starving." His company encountered their first group of civilian refugees on April 4th. Among them were 12 women, ranging from teenagers to elderly grandmothers. The women approached American lines with extreme caution. Some held white cloths torn from kimonos. Others carried small children. Their expectations could not have been clearer. They believed they were walking toward their execution. One woman later testified, "We thought they would kill us immediately. The propaganda had told us Americans were demons." Instead, Marines provided them with K-rations and water. A Navy corpsman treated minor injuries. Within hours, the women were transported to a hastily established collection point behind American lines. This pattern would repeat thousands of times over the coming weeks. The contrast between expectation and reality created profound psychological shock. Japanese military authorities had distributed pamphlets throughout Okinawa in the months before the invasion. These documents claimed American soldiers would rape women, murder children, and torture prisoners. The Imperial government had even distributed cyanide capsules to some civilians, encouraging suicide over surrender. Marine units established strict protocols for handling civilians. Military police sections were assigned specifically to process and protect non-combatants. Field orders emphasized that abuse of civilians would result in courts-martial. These policies reflected lessons learned from earlier campaigns and orders issued directly from Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet. By April 10th, American forces had secured approximately one-third of the island. The number of civilian refugees in American custody exceeded 10,000. This created immediate logistical challenges. Feeding, sheltering, and providing medical care for thousands of displaced persons required resources that had not been fully planned for. General Buckner authorized the establishment of civilian internment camps in the central region. These facilities were basic but functional. Army engineers constructed temporary shelters using canvas tents and wooden frames. Field kitchens provided hot meals twice daily. Medical teams treated injuries ranging from malnutrition to combat wounds. The women held in these camps struggled to comprehend their situation. Everything they had been taught about Americans contradicted what they experienced. This cognitive dissonance created a strange atmosphere in the camps, a mixture of relief, confusion, and residual fear. A report from the 10th Army Civil Affairs Section dated April 15th noted, "Civilian morale is fragile. Many refuse to believe they will not be harmed. Some request permission to commit suicide, having been conditioned to view death as preferable to capture." Military police and medical personnel worked to reassure the refugees, though language barriers made communication difficult. The reality was that American military policy had evolved significantly since early Pacific campaigns. The War Department had issued clear guidelines regarding civilian treatment in occupied territories. These guidelines emphasized distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, providing humanitarian assistance, and respecting local customs where possible. This policy reflected both practical military considerations and American values. Commanders recognized that humane treatment of civilians could reduce resistance and facilitate occupation. It also aligned with American self-image as liberators rather than conquerors. The contrast with Japanese military treatment of civilians in occupied territories was stark and intentional. By mid-April, the easy phase of the Okinawa campaign had ended. American forces pushing south encountered the main Japanese defensive lines. The battle that would consume the next 2 months began in earnest. But behind the front lines, the process of caring for Okinawan civilians continued to expand. April 5th through April 10th, 1945. The shock of survival began transforming into cautious hope for thousands of Okinawan women in American custody. The camps established in central Okinawa grew rapidly as more civilians emerged from hiding. Each day brought new groups, their faces showing the same mixture of fear and disbelief. Private Joe Salerno served with the 6th Marine Division Military Police Detachment assigned to camp security. His unit had received specific training before the invasion regarding civilian handling. Salerno later recorded his observations. "The women wouldn't look at us directly at first. They kept their heads down like they were waiting for something terrible to happen. When we gave them food, some of them cried." The food distribution process revealed the extent of civilian privation under Japanese military rule. Okinawa had been effectively under siege for months before the American invasion. Japanese forces had requisitioned most local food supplies. Civilian rations had been steadily reduced. Many Okinawans were surviving on sweet potatoes and whatever else they could forage. K rations provided by American forces contained more calories than many civilians had consumed in days. Each ration included canned meat, crackers, chocolate, and cigarettes. To refugees who had been starving, these packages represented unimaginable abundance. One woman later testified, "I could not believe they would feed us such good food. We thought we were going to die. Instead, they gave us meat and chocolate." Medical care presented another dramatic contrast. The United States military medical system in the Pacific had evolved significantly by 1945. Mobile Army surgical hospitals, known as MASH units, could provide advanced trauma care close to the front lines. Navy medical personnel staffed field hospitals treating both military and civilian casualties. Dr. Thomas Kelly served with the 77th Infantry Division Medical Battalion. His unit treated thousands of Okinawan civilians during April and May. Kelly recorded in his official report, "Malnutrition was universal. Many suffered from untreated infections, parasites, and chronic conditions. We treated everything from combat wounds to childbirth. The civilian population had received essentially no medical care for months." The MASH units used the latest medical technologies available in 1945. Sulfa drugs and the newly available penicillin dramatically reduced infection rates. Blood plasma for transfusions saved lives that would have been lost in earlier campaigns. Surgical techniques developed during 4 years of war allowed doctors to treat severe trauma cases with unprecedented success rates. For Okinawan women, this medical care contradicted everything propaganda had told them. They expected torture, not treatment. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Some women refused treatment initially, believing it was a trick or that they would be killed afterward. Medical personnel had to work patiently to overcome this conditioned fear. Language barriers complicated all interactions between American personnel and Okinawan civilians. The United States military had recruited Japanese-American soldiers from Hawaii and the mainland to serve as interpreters. These Nisei soldiers played crucial roles in communication and reassurance. Their presence helped convince Okinawan women that not all people of Japanese descent viewed surrender as dishonorable. The psychological impact of survival cannot be overstated. Japanese military culture emphasized death over surrender. The Bushido Code, as interpreted by wartime imperial propaganda, taught that capture brought dishonor worse than death. Civilians had been thoroughly indoctrinated in these values. For women specifically, propaganda emphasized that American soldiers would commit sexual violence before killing them. None of this happened. American military policy strictly prohibited abuse of civilians. The Uniform Code of Military Justice prescribed severe punishments for soldiers who violated these rules. Commanders enforced these policies rigorously. Several courts-martial were conducted during the Okinawa campaign for soldiers who mistreated civilians, sending clear messages about expected behavior. The camps themselves were basic but organized. Army engineers laid out tent cities with designated areas for families, single women, elderly, civilians, and those requiring medical care. Sanitation facilities were constructed following military field standards. Water purification units ensured safe drinking water. These measures prevented disease outbreaks that had plagued civilian refugee populations in earlier campaigns. Daily routines developed within the camps. Women organized themselves according to traditional Okinawan social structures. Older women assumed leadership roles, maintaining order and distributing resources. Children attended informal schools run by educated refugees. Japanese-American soldiers helped establish these institutions, bridging cultural and linguistic gaps. Security remained a concern. Japanese forces occasionally attempted to infiltrate the camps, either to gather intelligence or to eliminate refugees they viewed as traitors. American military police maintained careful watch, balancing security needs with respect for civilian dignity. The presence of female military personnel, primarily nurses, helped create safer spaces for women refugees. Food supplies presented ongoing logistical challenges. Feeding tens of thousands of civilians required diverting resources from military operations. The Navy's supply system, however, proved capable of meeting these demands. Ships arrived daily with provisions. Army logistics personnel organized distribution networks. Field bakeries produced fresh bread. Refrigeration ships provided fresh meat and vegetables when available. One report from April 20th documented the daily ration provided to civilian refugees. 2,000 calories per person, including rice, canned meat, vegetables, and bread. This exceeded what many Okinawans had received under Japanese military rule. The contrast was not lost on the refugees. As word spread that Americans provided adequate food and medical care, more civilians chose to surrender rather than flee deeper into Japanese-held territory. The psychological transformation occurring in the camps had strategic implications. Every civilian who chose surrender over suicide represented both a humanitarian success and a military advantage. Refugees provided intelligence about Japanese positions and defensive preparations. More importantly, their survival and treatment undermined Japanese propaganda among both civilians and soldiers still in combat zones. By April 25th, over 50,000 Okinawan civilians were in American custody. This number would grow to over 200,000 by the battle's end. The system developed to handle this population, though imperfect, represented a significant achievement in military humanitarian operations. April 20th through April 30th, 1945. As the battle for southern Okinawa intensified, the civilian internment camps in American-controlled territory became small cities. The women held in these facilities began confronting a reality they had never imagined. Not just survival, but the possibility of life beyond war. The United States Army Civil Affairs Division bore responsibility for managing civilian populations in combat zones. This specialized branch had evolved throughout the war, learning from experiences in North Africa, Italy, and France. By 1945, Civil Affairs had developed sophisticated protocols for occupied territories. Okinawa presented unique challenges due to the cultural and linguistic barriers, but the basic framework proved adaptable. Major General William Bradford commanded civil affairs operations on Okinawa. His staff included specialists in public health, infrastructure, food distribution, and education. They worked closely with military commanders to coordinate civilian relief efforts without compromising combat operations. Bradford's orders emphasized a crucial principle. Civilian cooperation must be earned through humane treatment and demonstrated trustworthiness. The women in the camps gradually adapted to their new circumstances. The initial shock of survival gave way to practical concerns about daily life. Traditional Okinawan social structures reasserted themselves within the camps. Women organized communal cooking, childcare, and elderly care. This self-organization impressed American administrators who encouraged it as a way to maintain order with minimal military oversight. One administrator's report noted, "The women have established their own governance structures. Elderly matriarchs make decisions regarding internal camp affairs. We intervene only when necessary for security or health concerns. This arrangement benefits both civilian welfare and military efficiency." Medical care continued expanding as more doctors and nurses arrived from rear area hospitals. The initial emergency treatment phase transitioned to longer-term health management. Navy medical teams established clinics providing ongoing care for chronic conditions. Army dental units offered services many Okinawans had never received. Public health specialists implemented sanitation and disease prevention programs. The availability of medical care created unexpected emotional moments. Okinawan women who had prepared for death now received treatment that saved lives. Mothers whose children had been malnourished watched them regain health. Elderly women with untreated conditions received pain relief and care. These experiences created profound gratitude mixed with continued confusion about American intentions. Food distribution evolved from emergency rations to more sustainable systems. Army logistics personnel established supply chains bringing in rice, vegetables, and other staples. The rice was particularly important, providing familiar food helped reduce the psychological stress of displacement. Field bakeries supplemented rations with fresh bread. When available, fresh fish was distributed, maintaining connections to traditional Okinawan diet. The quantity and quality of food astonished the refugees. Under Japanese military administration, civilian rations had been steadily reduced as resources went to the army. Many Okinawans had been surviving on minimal calories for months. The American provision of adequate food represented a dramatic contrast. Some women initially refused to believe they would continue receiving rations, fearing it was temporary. A report from the 10th Army Quartermaster dated April 28th documented daily food distribution. Civilian rations now exceed 150 tons daily. Rice comprises approximately 40%. Canned meats, vegetables, and bread make up the remainder. Caloric content averages 2,000 per person per day. We anticipate increasing this to 2,200 calories as supply chains stabilize. Children in the camps became focal points for American humanitarian efforts. The sight of malnourished children affected American soldiers deeply. Many Marines and soldiers had children back home. They saw Okinawan children not as enemy civilians, but as innocent victims of war. This empathy translated into extra efforts to provide care, including treats from personal rations. Japanese-American interpreters played increasingly important roles as communication improved. These Nisei soldiers served as cultural bridges, explaining American policies and intentions. They also helped American commanders understand Okinawan perspectives and concerns. Their work was often emotionally difficult. They were Americans serving their country while working with people who shared their ethnic heritage but had been raised under very different circumstances. Staff Sergeant George Nakamura served as chief interpreter at one of the larger camps. He later reflected, "The women couldn't understand why we would help them. In their worldview, defeat meant destruction. The concept of humane treatment of defeated enemies was foreign. I spent hours explaining American values, trying to bridge a gap that propaganda had made enormous." The camps faced practical challenges beyond food and medicine. Shelter remained basic. Canvas tents provided protection from rain, but little privacy. Clothing was in short supply. The Army provided some military surplus items, but these were ill-fitting and foreign to Okinawan culture. Women adapted military blankets into traditional-style garments, maintaining cultural identity despite circumstances. Sanitation systems worked adequately, but required constant maintenance. Army engineers regularly inspected latrines, water points, and waste disposal systems. Public health teams monitored for disease outbreaks. The close quarters and stress of displacement created ideal conditions for epidemics, but careful management prevented major outbreaks. Security concerns remained constant. Japanese military forces occasionally conducted raids attempting to recapture refugees or eliminate those they deemed traitors. American military police maintained perimeter guards and conducted regular patrols. Several firefights occurred near camp boundaries, though casualties among civilians were avoided through quick evacuations to shelter areas. The women's adaptation to American custody varied by age and background. Elderly women, shaped by traditional Okinawan culture that predated intense Japanese militarization, adapted somewhat more easily. They remembered when Okinawa had maintained distinct cultural identity before being fully integrated into the Japanese Empire. Younger women, educated entirely under Imperial Japanese system, struggled more with the cognitive dissonance between propaganda and reality. Some women maintained loyalty to Japan despite their treatment. They viewed American kindness with suspicion, believing it served some hidden purpose. Others began questioning everything they had been taught. The propaganda's complete failure to predict reality created space for doubt about other official narratives. A few became actively grateful, recognizing that American policies had saved their lives. The camp populations included women from all social classes. Some were educated, literate, and from relatively prosperous families. Others were poor, illiterate, and from rural areas. These class distinctions persisted within the camps, but were less rigid than in Japanese-controlled Okinawa. American administrators treated all civilians equally in terms of rations and medical care, which itself represented a departure from Japanese military practice that prioritized urban elites. By month's end, the system for managing civilian refugees had stabilized. Daily routines were established. Supply chains functioned reliably. Medical care reached acceptable standards. The camps were no one's idea of comfort, but they provided safety, food, and health care. For women who had expected death, this represented an outcome impossible to imagine just weeks earlier. May 1st through May 15th, 1945. The battle for southern Okinawa had become the costliest campaign in the Pacific War. While Marines and soldiers fought desperately against entrenched Japanese defenses, the civilian population behind American lines continued growing. Over 100,000 Okinawans were now in United States custody. The logistics of caring for this population rivaled the challenges of combat operations. The Southern Offensive revealed the full horror of Japanese defensive tactics. Lieutenant General Ushijima had fortified a system of ridges, caves, and tunnels. His forces fought with suicidal determination. American casualties mounted steadily. The 10th Army suffered over 7,000 killed and 31,000 wounded during the campaign. Japanese casualties were far higher, over 90,000 combat deaths. This slaughter occurred while, miles to the north, American forces provided food and medical care to thousands of Japanese civilians. The contrast could not have been starker. Japanese soldiers died in caves and bunkers defending an already lost island. Japanese civilians survived in American camps, receiving care that exceeded what their own government had provided. General Buckner maintained strict policies regarding civilian treatment despite the intensity of combat. His orders acknowledged the psychological strain on troops fighting desperate battles while showing restraint toward civilians. Courts-martial were conducted for several soldiers who, traumatized by combat, lashed out at civilians. These cases sent clear messages about expected conduct. The camps expanded to accommodate the growing population. Army engineers constructed more permanent structures, replacing temporary tents. Wooden barracks provided better shelter. Communal buildings housed schools and medical clinics. The camps began resembling small towns rather than temporary facilities. Education became a priority. The Civil Affairs Division recognized that children needed structured activity. Japanese-American soldiers organized schools teaching basic subjects. The curriculum carefully avoided propaganda, focusing on mathematics, reading, and practical skills. Some Okinawan women volunteered as teachers, appreciating the opportunity to maintain normalcy for children. Medical care evolved to address long-term health needs. Initial emergency treatment had stabilized acute conditions. Now doctors addressed chronic problems, dental care, treatment for parasites, management of malnutrition-related conditions. Navy hospitals admitted serious cases requiring surgery or extended care. The military medical system treated Okinawan civilians using the same resources and standards applied to American personnel. A statistical report from mid-May documented medical activities. Civilian medical encounters total over 300,000 since April 1st. These include 72,000 initial examinations, 150,000 follow-up treatments, 45,000 dental procedures, and various surgical operations. Mortality rate among civilians in American custody, 0.3%, comparable to stateside populations. Food distribution had become routine but required massive logistical effort. Daily supplies included rice, vegetables, canned meats, bread, and occasional fresh fish. The Quartermaster Corps dedicated entire supply ships to civilian rations. One ship, the USS Antares, made weekly runs carrying nothing but food for Okinawan refugees. This represented a diversion of shipping capacity from military operations, yet commanders never questioned the necessity. The cultural aspects of food became important. Okinawan women preferred rice as the staple grain. American logistics adapted, shifting from bread-heavy rations to rice-based meals. Women established communal kitchens, preparing food according to traditional methods when possible. This cultural accommodation helped maintain morale and cultural identity. Some women began working for American forces. With interpreter assistance, they took positions in laundries, kitchens, and clinics. This provided both useful service and psychological benefits. Women who worked felt less like helpless refugees and more like contributing members of their communities. American commanders encouraged this employment, paying modest wages that allowed women to purchase small luxuries from military post exchanges. The psychological adjustment continued gradually. Women who had expected to die now contemplated futures they had never imagined. Some hoped to return to their homes when fighting ended, not knowing whether those homes still existed. Others began accepting that life had changed permanently. A few expressed interest in learning English, recognizing that American occupation would likely continue indefinitely. Interactions between American personnel and Okinawan civilians remained formally correct but became less tense over time. Marines and soldiers initially approached civilian areas with caution, uncertain how refugees would react. As weeks passed, children began approaching soldiers with curiosity. Some women asked questions through interpreters about American life and customs. Small gestures, sharing candy with children, helping repair shelters, built tentative trust. Not all interactions were positive. Isolated incidents of theft and black market activity occurred. Some American soldiers attempted to take advantage of vulnerable women. Military police responded to these incidents swiftly and seriously. Courts-martial sent strong messages that exploitation would not be tolerated. The vast majority of American personnel behaved professionally, but the minority who did not face significant consequences. Japanese military forces continued attempting to influence the civilian population. Propaganda leaflets dropped into camps warned that American kindness was temporary. Japanese radio broadcasts claimed that civilians would be enslaved or used as forced labor. Some refugees believed these messages despite contrary evidence. Others dismissed Japanese propaganda entirely, recognizing that nothing predicted about Americans had proven true. Security incidents illustrated the ongoing danger. On May 12th, Japanese soldiers infiltrated one camp attempting to sabotage food storage. Military police killed 3 infiltrators in a brief firefight. No civilians were injured, but the incident reminded everyone that the war continued nearby. Women in the camps could hear artillery fire from the southern battles, a constant reminder of the violence they had escaped. The scale of civilian care operations impressed even those managing them. Colonel James Stevenson commanded civil affairs for the Central District. His report from May 15th noted, "We are now feeding, housing, and providing medical care for a population equivalent to a medium-sized American city. We do this while simultaneously supporting combat operations. The logistical achievement is remarkable, though seldom recognized compared to battle honors." By mid-May, patterns had stabilized. The civilian refugee system functioned efficiently. Supply chains worked reliably. Medical care reached adequate standards. Educational and employment programs provided structure and purpose. The camps were far from ideal, but they represented functioning communities under difficult circumstances. The women held in these camps had survived what they believed impossible. They had faced death and found life instead. This experience would shape their understanding of the war, their country, and themselves in ways that would only become fully apparent years later. May 20th through June 20th, 1945. As the battle for Okinawa entered its final phase, the full scope of American humanitarian efforts became evident. Over 200,000 Okinawan civilians were now in United States custody. This represented the largest civilian population ever managed by American military forces during active combat operations. The scale challenged every aspect of military administration. The fighting in the South reached its conclusion during June. Japanese resistance finally collapsed after 3 months of desperate combat. General Ushijima and his chief of staff committed ritual suicide on June 22nd, ending organized Japanese military operations. The cost had been staggering on all sides. Over 12,000 Americans killed, 38,000 wounded. Over 100,000 Japanese military dead. Civilian casualties among those still in Japanese-controlled areas exceeded 40,000. Yet among the 200,000 civilians in American custody, the death rate remained remarkably low. Civil affairs reports documented mortality at less than 1%, comparable to rates in peaceful civilian populations. This statistic represented one of the war's quiet triumphs. Women who had been promised death as the inevitable result of American victory instead survived at rates that would have been normal in peacetime. The final statistics told a compelling story. From April through June, American forces provided over 30 million meals to Okinawan civilians. Medical personnel conducted over 800,000 patient encounters. Army engineers constructed shelter for the equivalent of a major city. The Quartermaster Corps diverted thousands of tons of shipping capacity to civilian supplies. All this occurred simultaneously with the costliest land battle in Pacific War history. General Buckner never saw the full results of his policies. He was killed by Japanese artillery fire on June 18th, just days before the battle's end. His replacement, General Roy Geiger, continued the same policies toward civilians. The transition demonstrated that humane treatment was institutional policy, not dependent on individual commanders. The costs of these humanitarian efforts were substantial but considered necessary. Diverting resources to civilian care reduced available supplies for combat operations. Ships carrying rice and medical supplies could have carried ammunition and fuel instead. Yet American commanders never seriously questioned these priorities. The decision reflected both practical military judgment and fundamental American values. Practical considerations included the recognition that well-treated civilians were less likely to support continued Japanese resistance. Intelligence gathered from refugees proved valuable in planning operations. Humane treatment also served broader strategic purposes, demonstrating to Japanese military and civilians throughout the Pacific that surrender was preferable to suicidal resistance. But values mattered too. American military culture emphasized distinctions between combatants and civilians. The Geneva Conventions, which Japan had never signed, represented standards that Americans felt obligated to uphold. Even in the brutality of the Pacific War, most American commanders believed there were limits that separated civilized warfare from barbarism. The women themselves recognized these distinctions, though it took time. As the battle ended and peace settled over Okinawa, refugees began processing their experiences. Many recorded testimonies about their treatment, expressing amazement that they had survived. One woman's statement recorded by Civil Affairs in July, captured common sentiments. "We were taught Americans were demons. They treated us better than our own military ever did." The transition to occupation presented new challenges. With fighting over, attention shifted to reconstruction. Okinawa had been devastated. Cities were rubble. Agricultural land was torn by combat and filled with unexploded ordnance. Infrastructure was destroyed. The population faced a long, difficult recovery. American military government took responsibility for Okinawan administration. General Joseph Stilwell, commanding the 10th Army after Geiger's departure, implemented policies for long-term occupation. These built on the humanitarian framework established during combat. Food distribution continued. Medical care expanded. Reconstruction projects provided employment. Schools reopened under American supervision. The women in camps faced decisions about their futures. Some could return to home villages, finding relatives who had survived. Others discovered that their homes were destroyed and families killed. These women remained in what were now being called relocation centers rather than internment camps. The semantic change reflected shifting purposes. These were no longer temporary wartime facilities, but longer-term housing for displaced persons. Employment opportunities expanded during occupation. American forces needed workers for reconstruction, administration, and service roles. Okinawan women took positions as clerks, translators, teachers, and nurses. This employment provided both income and purpose. It also created daily contact between Okinawans and Americans, gradually normalizing relations between former enemies. The psychological transformation among Okinawan civilians became a subject of study. Military psychiatrists documented the long-term effects of the dramatic contrast between propaganda and reality. Many women described their experiences as fundamentally life-changing. The expectation of death followed by survival and care had shaken their entire worldview. Some expressed gratitude toward Americans. Others maintained loyalty to Japan while acknowledging American humanity. All agreed that their survival was unexpected. The broader implications extended beyond Okinawa. American policies there influenced planning for the occupation of Japan itself. When Japan surrendered in August following the atomic bombings, American forces applied lessons learned on Okinawa to the much larger task of occupying the home islands. The framework of humane treatment, civilian care, and economic support that worked on Okinawa became the template for post-war Japan. Historical assessments have consistently noted the Okinawa campaign's unusual character. It was simultaneously one of the war's bloodiest battles and one of its most successful humanitarian operations. These two aspects, horrific combat and comprehensive civilian care, coexisted throughout the campaign. This duality reflected the complexity of modern warfare and the American military's capacity to wage combat operations while maintaining humanitarian standards. The women who survived told their stories to children and grandchildren. Their testimonies form important historical records. Many described their survival as miraculous, though it was not miracle but policy that saved them. American military decisions, implemented by thousands of soldiers, sailors, doctors, and administrators, created conditions where survival was possible even amid catastrophic warfare. By war's end, over 250,000 Okinawan civilians had passed through American care systems. The vast majority survived, were fed, received medical treatment, and were eventually resettled. This represented unprecedented humanitarian achievement during active combat. The statistics were remarkable, but the individual stories were even more powerful. Each woman who survived was a person who had expected death and found life instead. The legacy of these policies extended through post-war years. Okinawa remained under American military administration until 1972. The relationship between Okinawans and Americans, while never without tension, was fundamentally shaped by the treatment civilians received during the battle. Women who survived told their children that Americans had shown mercy when none was expected. This memory influenced Okinawan attitudes toward the long American presence on their island. The Battle of Okinawa ended on June 22, 1945. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers died defending the island. Over 12,000 Americans gave their lives, taking it. Yet amid this slaughter, American forces saved over 250,000 Okinawan civilians, feeding, sheltering, and providing medical care throughout the campaign. The women who survived carried memories of those months for the rest of their lives. They had been taught that surrender meant death. They discovered instead that survival was possible. This experience fundamentally changed their understanding of warfare, honor, and humanity. Their testimonies form an important historical record, documenting both the horror of war and the possibility of maintaining humanitarian standards even in the worst circumstances. The policies implemented on Okinawa reflected American military culture at its best. Commanders recognized that civilians were not enemies simply because they shared nationality with enemy soldiers. Resources were diverted from combat operations to provide humanitarian assistance. Medical personnel treated Okinawan injuries with the same care given to American wounded. These decisions had costs, but were never seriously questioned. American forces proved capable of waging brutal combat while simultaneously managing massive humanitarian operations. This dual capacity distinguished American military operations from those of other powers in World War II. The contrast was particularly stark compared to Japanese military treatment of civilians in occupied territories. Okinawan women recognized this difference, even when loyalty to Japan prevented them from saying so publicly. The numbers tell part of the story. 30 million meals served, 800,000 medical encounters, 250,000 civilians protected. But statistics cannot capture individual experiences. The woman who expected execution receiving food instead, the child treated by Navy doctors, the elderly grandmother given shelter and care in her final days. These individual stories aggregate into a larger historical truth. Even in total war, humanity can persist. Even when propaganda teaches hatred, people can choose mercy. Even when military necessity seems to require harshness, policies can prioritize care. The women of Okinawa survived because Americans made decisions that reflected their values as well as their strategic interests. The legacy extended far beyond 1945. The humanitarian framework developed on Okinawa influenced American occupation policies throughout Japan. Lessons learned managing civilian populations shaped post-war reconstruction. The experience demonstrated that humane treatment of defeated enemies served both moral and practical purposes. Over 100,000 Okinawan women survived the Battle of Okinawa when they expected to die. Their survival was no accident. It resulted from policy decisions, institutional frameworks, and individual choices by thousands of American military personnel. That is the story worth remembering, not just the horror of war, but the persistent possibility of humanity within it.